Good morning. I see a bunch of faces that look like they got up at approximately 6:53 this morning. I thought I was setting the wake-up call only for me, so my apologies. I've had a couple people ask about sharing cabs or rides to the airport. People are going at various times. Mike Weiss, where are you? Yeah, Mike has Mike and Jim Streckvis have a cab scheduled for 3 o'clock this afternoon. There are a couple people leaving early in the morning. If you are looking to share a ride, maybe raise your hand and we'll see if anybody can share. Yes, Ted? That's 5 this afternoon? Okay. Well, see me and Mike Weiss gave me the name and number of the cab driver who brought him out to the conference and who's taken him back, who is showing an enterprising amount of business acumen. Yes?
We're leaving at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning to the hotel. Anyone who needs a ride to the airport, see me.
There we go. That's James Pratt, everyone, leaving at 3 a.m. tomorrow. All right. With those announcements, one question, or comment, if anybody didn't get a swag bag, come see me. I have a few left. And if you have not yet visited the swap room, I'll get to you in just a second, Tom. If you haven't visited the swap room, take a look. Somebody can show you where it is. If you haven't seen it, there's books out on a table. Leave one, take one, or take one. And then there's some displays. If you do go in there and the people with the displays aren't there, please leave them alone. Feel free to look, but we don't want anything. And don't break Ron Mayo's model. It's a beautiful, beautiful model. Any other housekeeping? Tom? You got one. You did, the tote bag from yesterday. All right, I'll get you. Our first speaker today is Dr. Roger Connor, who serves as the lead curator for the World War I and World War II exhibitions currently under development at the National Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian, as well as a temporary exhibition on advanced air mobility. He is also a supporting curator on the Modern Military Aviation Gallery and a temporary exhibition highlighting aerospace innovations to combat climate change. Roger curates the museum's collections of rotorcraft and VTOL aircraft, drones, Army Ground Force aviation, instruments and avionics, along with infrastructure and ground support equipment. He has a BA from Virginia Tech and an MA in Museum Studies from George Washington, an MA in American History from George Mason, and a Ph.D. in American History from George Mason University. Roger's an experienced fixed-wing commercial pilot with over 4,000 hours of flight time, including over 3,000 hours in dual instruction given. He's held flight instructor certificates in the United States and the UK, and served as a designated private pilot examiner for the UK CAA. He also holds a seaplane rating and has nearly completed the requirements for a private pilot's helicopter rating. You see that Apache out there? Who knows? Maybe one day, Roger. Please give a warm welcome to Roger Connor, Dr. Roger Connor.
Thanks so much. Thank you for that introduction. For a project like this, there are many dozens of people that are necessary to bring it to fruition. And my job is essentially as an editor. I'm not a literal text editor, but my job is to take the contributions and concepts from a lot of different people, a lot of very smart people, and translate them to contractors and other people that are responsible for fabricating this idea in 3 dimensions. And I would like to start by thanking a few of those folks here today that have been instrumental in this project. So our next speaker, Chris Moore, we've got Larry Burke. Carl Bobrow has done a lot in terms of the artifacts and some of the structural elements that you'll see of the gallery today. Some of the others have helped support us as well. Charlie Goss is here today. Steve Sotheby's even popped in to advise us in some capacities. So it's been it's a team effort, and it's a very complicated exercise to do something like this. And I really want to emphasize that it takes a whole community to do a World War I exhibit, and thank you for those that have participated. So our story begins on August 23rd of 2011, which for the West Coast, a fairly moderate earthquake, but for the East Coast, one of the more significant ones in modern memory occurred, and this was in Central Virginia. The outcome of this was that a lot of masonry and stone-faced buildings in the D.C. area suffered some damage. So, for instance, the Washington Monument was closed for a period of time. National Cathedral suffered some extensive damage. And so a lot of the federal buildings and other masonry structures in the area had to undertake an extensive review of their facilities. Now, the Air and Space Museum had known for a while that its exterior facing was not in great shape. So when a thorough review of the structure was undertaken at this time, a lot of problems were revealed. And the problems weren't so much from the earthquake, but from the design itself. So if we go back to about 1975, when the Air and Space Museum was under construction, of course, there was some economic turbulence at that time, so one of the cost-saving measures had been to reduce the thickness of the structural facing of the Tennessee marble that was on the outside of the museum. So they went from 3-inch thick facing down to 1.25-inch facing. What this did was to take the lifespan of that facing material from an indefinite period down to 40 years. So not surprisingly, in the early 2010s, things were beginning to go wrong in a fairly significant way, and it was realized that a entire removal of that whole facing was going to have to be undertaken. And so whatever savings were achieved in 1975 are essentially going to cost 2 orders of magnitude more today. And the scale of the project is truly immense. So we're looking at about $250 million in federal appropriations, which covers the physical building. So not only the facing, but all those kind of structural modifications that are involved in that. Unfortunately, when that facing is removed, that's basically exposing the entire environment of the building to the atmosphere, and as a result, everything has to be pulled out from the interior as part of this process. So all the exhibits have to go. And of course, that unfortunately includes the museum's World War I aviation exhibit, A Legend, Memory, and the Great War in the Air, which had opened in 1991. So this was closed in 2018. Work on the new gallery had begun in earnest in 2016. Opening now is targeted for the beginning of July of 2025. So we're still a little ways out, but progress has been significant on the new project. The design is essentially at 100% complete now. There's still quite a lot of work left to do on the path. Now, when we're considering what is the new gallery doing versus what we've done in the past, it is worth looking back at some of the past iterations of World War I aviation at the National Air and Space Museum. So really the first exhibition space that we had in earnest for aviation was the so-called tin shed that was erected in 1918 behind the Smithsonian Castle. And if you were to hop in a time machine and see an interesting World War I exhibit, set course for the mid-1920s, there was a lot to see at the time. Unfortunately, not everything in this space has survived to the present day. Some of you may be aware that the F5L wings are no longer present with the aircraft, nor is the stabilizer or rudder. The oral tradition in the museum is that in 1927, when the NC-4 was acquired by the museum, the fuselage was being shipped out, and Paul Garber, who was in charge of the collections at that time, realized that there was not space for both the NC-4 fuselage and the F5L. And so he contacted the Naval Aircraft Factory and said, can you guys display this, in your facility? And they said, oh, sure, yeah, we'll send a team down and, and disassemble it, and we'll ship it back up. So the team comes down, they're starting to disassemble it. Garber goes to lunch, comes back, and the wings are in the process of being broken up completely. And Garber says, I didn't think you were going to be doing this. And they said, no, we're just supposed to bring the fuselage back. And he said, hey, look, if that's all you're doing, we'll keep the fuselage. So unfortunately, the wings were lost there in 1927. It wasn't really until 1971 that a more significant interpretation of World War I aviation was undertaken at the museum. There just simply wasn't space. So after the mid-1920s, other aircraft from the interwar period and the World War II and the Cold War era, as those aircraft flooded in, the World War I presence got compressed smaller and smaller within the tin shed space. But in 1971, when Senator Goldwater was able to push the authorization through for the new National Air and Space Museum on the National Mall, there was awareness that 20 galleries, which is kind of our footprint of exhibition galleries, there were going to have to be 20 galleries constructed in the space of just about 4 years. So there was kind of a panic stampede to figure out how those spaces were going to be filled. So one wing of the Arts and Industry building was essentially given over as a kind of a trial presentation space. And World War I was essentially the first kind of one of these major trial exhibitions that was undertaken. And so the idea was to create something that was very focused on pursuit aviation and to use a lot of kind of theatrical elements to create an immersive space. And so here we see the design from 1971. So this exhibit was installed in 1972. And so you see some fan favorites that were in the gallery, and a lot of the specialized treatments that were put in place. And not a lot of interpretation, though. So, but keep in mind, 1971, we're only 53 years after the end of the war. There's a lot of World War I aviators still around. There's a lot of visitors that have lived memories of that period of time. Certainly, a lot of World War I aviations permeated popular culture. So really, the exhibit was serving as a touchstone more so, and a commemoration more so than a overtly interpretive space. So that exhibition was essentially repurposed in 1976 when the National Mall building opened. One of the featured aircraft was actually a loan. So this was Dolph Overton's SPAD 7. And if you're not familiar with Overton, Google him. He's got a fascinating story. It's quite remarkable. So, and this SPAD 7, by the way, is the one that's at the San Diego Air and Space Museum today. And again, you can kind of see the immersive environment, and maybe, so I believe this came in a little bit later in the process of the D5A. You can probably get a sense maybe of the problem that emerged with this exhibit, and it's the materiality of the construction. So there's a lot of wood and burlap. There's Mitchell's SPAD 16. And what wound up happening is this was a magnet for pests. So there were infestations, rodents, insects. Some of the uniforms started to get nibbled on. So this exhibit was not particularly long-lived by the museum standards, and it had to be pulled out in 1986 because of these issues. At that time, the space was turned over as a temporary exhibition space. The first aircraft to go in was Ray Brooks's SPAD 13, which had just finished its restoration process, and so a 90-year-old Brooks was able to come out and show off the aircraft and meet visitors. So that was kind of a special thing. But there wasn't really a strong World War I interpretation there. So an effort was made to really do something new and interesting for the museum. And this resulted in Legend, Memory, and the Great War in the Air, which we said would open in 1991. This was really a milestone exhibition for the museum because it was a shift in emphasis from essentially being a technology display, an aircraft with a label, to something that was a lot more interpretive and providing a lot more context. One of the reasons, of course, this was important is now there aren't those World War I veterans available to tell their story. World War I is starting to fade from popular culture. It's certainly faded from the lived memory of the vast majority of the visitors. So the museum had to start taking on, first with World War I, but it's something that we're now dealing with other periods as well, that visitors are often coming in with very little understanding about the topic. They don't really have a good frame of reference. So a lot of thought was put in, how do we do that? How do we connect with the visitors and create a point of entry for them, and then be able to tell a story that's meaningful, that really conveys the breadth and experience of World War I aviation. And so what was hit upon, I think, was a very clever idea. So it was to take something that was familiar with the visitors, and so Snoopy and the Red Baron, a lot of the kind of popular culture elements that still permeated culture at that point, and basically say, okay, you may know about this topic in this way, but here's what it's really like. So the exhibition tried to set up that contrast as a way of bringing visitors into it. The other aspect was to try and move beyond the simple pursuit aviation component. So talk about some of the other aspects of World War I aviation that contributed to later developments. And so you get a sense of this is the brochure that was handed out with the exhibit, and you get a sense of the various points of emphasis. And so the entry for the gallery, the kind of entry bay of the gallery, was very much given over to setting this foundational aspect of popular culture. So saying that in the 30s there were the pulp comics that focused on aviation. There's Dawn Patrol, Hell's Angels, and then we've got Charles Schultz and Snoopy and Blue Max in the 60s. So there are these kind of periods of enthusiasm that kind of develop for World War I aviation, but they are heavily focused on aces and pursuit aviation, and kind of formulate some of the mythology around Knights of the Air that obscure some of the topics that, of course, this audience, I think, knows so well. And so this was, I think, a great way of doing it, and kind of a brilliant approach. There were a couple challenges that emerged from the exhibit. One is the gallery had two entrances and exits, and so half the visitors would go in the other end. So the other end of the exhibit was focused on strategic bombing. So it featured a mock-up of a tube station entrance talking about the bombing campaign about London, against London, and also trying to contextualize strategic bombing as part of what Mark Clodfelter would do so well later, and identify it as part of that progressive trend that strategic bombing advocates were seeking to solve the problem of trench warfare and the horrific nature of warfare by creating a quick strike that would end warfare quickly. And so the gallery was trying to get to that idea. Unfortunately, that was not entirely well received. The gallery opened in the immediate aftermath of Desert Storm. Some air power advocates did not like that sort of nuance being described in it. So that was one challenge of the gallery. And so a lot of visitors that would come in that end of the gallery kind of missed the point. They were missing that popular culture angle. So that was one sort of challenge. There was a very clever setup for the gallery, but sometimes the visitors just bypassed it entirely. It was also difficult to kind of set up that contrast in the main body of the exhibit. So a lot of great artifacts, but it was hard to kind of contextualize them. The setup of the gallery itself was fairly maze-like, and that was done on purpose to kind of convey to the visitor some of that claustrophobia of the trenches and be evocative in that way. One of the nice things is that some of the aircraft were displayed in a now pest-free environment where visitors could get quite close to them. And you get extensive use of mannequins. Things like manufacturing were covered. We had Cole Palin's FE-8 in the center to talk about technology. However, you can see one of the problems here with the Albatross is that some of the more interesting aircraft were positioned hanging, but done in a way such that the maze-like environment below made sight lines to them very difficult. So, for instance, we've got the snipe here that you can see. This was about the best angle you could get on it. This is a great view of the Voisin 8, but it required a scissor lift to get this picture. So you were usually looking at it from below, not ideal for such a fantastic artifact. So when we were considering the new gallery, these were some of the challenges that we were dealing with. So in terms of space, unfortunately, we're a little bit smaller for the new gallery, which is, if you've been in the gallery in the museum for the last 2 decades, you're probably familiar with where the Wright brothers space was. That's the new space that we're occupying. And it's about 600 square feet smaller than the previous space. And so it's about 75 feet on a side, which means that we have to be pretty efficient. So when we are working on an exhibit, of course, one of the things that we want to understand is who is our audience, and how do we connect with them. And in terms of visitorship, the National Air and Space Museum has typically been about 7 million or so over the last 2 decades. Couple things on here. If you notice, there's a discrepancy between 2003 and 2004. That's because they changed the method by which visitors are counted. So more accurate accounting resulted in a lower count. And of course, in COVID, and due to closure of much of the museum, we've dropped off significantly. But we can assume that 5.5 million people is kind of the annually is the standard target for downtown. Not all of those would necessarily go through the World War I exhibit, but let's say a quarter do. So visitation to the gallery on an annual basis is maybe a little over 1 million. So it's a lot of people coming through, and it's hard to think of another venue on World War I aviation that's likely to have as much throughput. So it's a significant burden and obligation that we've got to try and make this work. There are challenges. I think I put this in here not to be provocative, but really to showcase some of the trends that influence how exhibits are made. And literacy is not going in a great direction. So 21% of American adults are functionally illiterate, and we have 54% are reading at below a 6th grade level. The visitors to the museum do tend to be a bit higher. In the late 90s, there was a survey that found about 65% of the visitors to the National Air and Space Museum had bachelor's degrees. But nonetheless, this has essentially a mandate, and that mandate is for exhibitions, we need to show it, not say it. That doesn't mean we don't have words on the wall, but that means when we do have words on the wall, they have to be very carefully crafted. And we have to really look at accessibility. We have to look at the readability of that phrasing. And a lot of thought goes into that. And in fact, it's probably the most kind of time-consuming part of the whole process is trying to make language that is both accurate and accessible. So it's a huge, huge challenge. But at the end of the day for us, it really puts the pressure on making sure that we have a variety of different mechanisms to engage visitors in ways that are not in literal text. Another problem that we have to be concerned about is that cultural institutions are not necessarily the favored venue. And of course, as you well know, with World War I aviation, there's not a lot of movies being made about it. Sometimes there's video games, but generally speaking, there are not a lot of there's not a lot of avenues for cultural transference on this topic. So it's something that we really have to keep in mind. And to get an idea of the magnitude of the problem, I'll share 2 anecdotes. The first is that this gallery has not been able to find a funder. That doesn't mean we're not doing it. It just means that we're relying on funding from other sources to kind of fill in. So our World War II gallery, for instance, has been sponsored at 200%. So essentially the World War II gallery is funding this one. And that's partly because World War II is still emphasized strongly in schools. It's something that is perceived as being core to American identity, where unfortunately World War I really is not. Another anecdote, when we were in the conceptual phase of the exhibit, we had a pro bono relationship established with one of the leaders in public interpretation, a guy named Brand Farron, who is the founder of a company called Applied Minds out in Burbank. And he was Disney's top Imagineer back in the 80s and 90s, and is now, his company is essentially the go-to internationally for theme parks and for some reason government command centers. But he came to the museum, and I showed him through the World War I gallery and said, this is what we're trying to do, this is how we're trying to reach visitors. He was utterly befuddled as to why we wanted a World War I gallery. For him, if it wasn't leading technology and it wasn't core to American identity, why bother with it? And so that was an eye-opening moment where we realized that we really have to make a very strong case as to why we're doing this exhibit, why World War I aviation is important, why people need to see these artifacts, why they need to know about it. So when we craft an exhibit, one of the things that we want to do is develop a big idea. It's at the most basic level, it's an elevator pitch, but it's what we bring out to say, hey, this is why this matters, this is why it's important. So for our exhibit, this was the big idea. So really to emphasize that this is a foundation. If you want to know the foundation of aviation today, you have to know about this topic. And that's it, right? It's, it can be exciting and interesting and thrilling and all the things that bring us together on this topic, but at the end of the day, for the outsider, right, this is really what we're trying to say, is that, without what happens in World War I, aviation ultimately looks very different. Now, I need to give credit to our gallery's originator, who was Peter Jacobs. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's now retired, but and he was World War I curator when the exhibition started. Unfortunately, he was also our assistant director for curatorial affairs, and so didn't have the bandwidth to actually put the gallery together. So that's why our team was created to facilitate his vision. And so he gave us kind of 3 marching orders for how to execute on this. So the first was essentially this, that to really emphasize the idea of World War I being the critical laboratory, particularly for military aviation. All the roles and missions that we're familiar with in military aviation today, the vast majority of those come out of the moment that we see between 1914 and 1918. Another element to it in terms of being able to engage the visitors in an intense and emotionally engaging way was to emphasize the experience of World War I aviation. So the sights and sounds that make World War I aviation unique and different. So things that, why is it different than what people have seen before? And of course, if you were at a World War I flying collection, it's that type of appeal. So we wanted to be able to bring some of that into the gallery. And lastly, he wanted to have Javier Arango's camel as the centerpiece of the gallery. So we took those kind of 3 steps and built out from there. One of the other things that we do as part of the conceptual process is to develop interpretive messages. So these are kind of the next step down. How do we connect to that big idea? What are the approaches that we're going to take to the visitor? So one of the things that we want to do is emphasize that experience. The key ways is working with outside operators of vintage aircraft. So we're working extensively with Old Rhinebeck to film there, and essentially we will have a high definition, very large format presentation to be able to see the sights and sounds of aircraft and put that in the context of period operators of the technology. Our second point here is that we really want to emphasize that kind of milestone aspect, emphasize the novelty of aviation. So one of the notes that we hit a lot are kind of the key moments where new things have been implemented. So, that might be, the first raid on London, but it might also be the first submarine sunk by aircraft. So a lot of those important firsts that define modern military roles will be emphasized there. And then lastly, we want to emphasize the aviation industry itself as being launched in large part by the war. And in terms of things that we're putting on the wall, this is our introductory statement. So this visitor wouldn't see those other statements in literal form. This is how we've essentially distilled those ideas down, and this is how we are introducing the gallery to those ends. So in terms of design, I mentioned that we are a fairly small space overall. And so we've got to do a lot of work. We've got to be very efficient. This past March, I was out at Museum of Flight going through their World War I exhibit, and I would say in terms of kind of our scope and tone, we're actually quite similar to what they've done. They do have the benefit of being about 4 or 5 times larger in their square footage. So we're trying to do a lot of what they do. Imagine what's at Museum of Flight getting compressed down into a considerably smaller space. And so we have to be a bit more clever in terms of how we use some of our various techniques for outreach. So digital media, mechanical interactives, our graphics, and other elements to try and capture visitors' attention. Typically in our museum, we have kind of our shorthand for how we describe visitor interaction with exhibits. We've got streakers, strollers, and scholars. So streakers are the tourists that are on the death march along the museums on the National Mall. They don't care what they see. They just want to say they've seen something. So they might take a selfie in front of something, post it, and then they're gone. And dwell time often less than 2 minutes. They literally dashing through spaces. So that, it's been a hot day. They've got the screaming kids. They don't really care. They're not there to be educated. They just want to say they've seen something. They're in and out. Unfortunately, there are a fair number of our visitors that kind of fall into that. So probably a good quarter, tend to fall into that. 50% probably what we call the stroll. It might be the visiting for the afternoon. Somebody that's really said, I want to go to the National Air and Space Museum. A little bit less concerned about what they see per se, but they're there to learn something. And that's really what we're trying to do, is engage that part of the target audience to get somebody that really maybe hasn't considered World War I aviation in a distinct way before, grab their attention, and hopefully the outcome is, the ideal scenario would be that they would go buy a book, if possible. But if nothing else, to at least next time they see something related to World War I aviation, think back and, I saw something on that caught my attention from before. And so we really want to foster dialogue. So, within a family or friend group or school group that's visiting, be able to foster a dialogue that's encouraging that process of thinking back on the visit and re-engaging with it. And then lastly, we have our scholar group, which are those people that they want to see something on World War I aviation. There's an interest in it that's targeted. And so we want to have the artifacts and the content that also engages that group as well. So it's a challenge, right? Kind of moving between these 3 different groups and having something for everybody. So, you want the good photo opportunity for the streakers. You want the kind of interesting anecdotes and stories that are going to bring in the strollers, and then you want some of those deep dives that are really going to speak to the people in this audience. So to do that, as I mentioned, we have to be fairly targeted, but we also have to make sure we've got adequate flow through our space. And so it's a constant balancing effort. We can't do everything. We can't show all of the artifacts that we have as much as we might want. We can't tell all the stories. So we try to balance the limitations of the space, the limitations of what the contractors can do, and the limitations of the collection itself. Our collection is very much, not surprisingly, front-loaded towards the American experience. It's also front-loaded towards the late war experience, but this is a gallery that deals with the entire frame of the war. So we have to think about, okay, where are the shortfalls, and how are those dealt with? In some cases, they might be dealt with in the interactive media or some of the AV productions. In terms of kind of detailed layout, this is how the gallery is set up. So we want to avoid the issue that we had with the prior gallery, where if you come in on one side, you're going to be missing kind of the main through experience. Nonetheless, there is one side that's a little bit more introductory than the other. So typically our west entrance, the left entrance, is going to be the one where we're emphasizing the chronology of the war a little bit more, a lot of those aviation firsts. The right entrance, the east entrance, is more focused on the legacy of World War I aviation. What are its contributions and long-standing aspects? And we did try to include some of those best elements of a legend, memory, and the Great War in the air, as you'll see. Bottom left is our units focused primarily on both the creation of aviation as a military profession, as well as the introduction of reconnaissance, and then the outgrowth of pursuit aviation as part of that. We've got Cole Palin's FE8 down in the bottom corner there as part of a unit that deals, subunit that deals with the arming of airplanes, and of course all the issues associated with that. Our unit 300 on the bottom there is meant to really emphasize that aviation at this time is not existing for its own benefit, that it is there to largely shape what's happening on the battlefield. And so what is that connection? So we want the visitor to be able to see what aviation brings to the table for the soldier on the battlefield at various points. We have a very limited and simplified trench environment, and it's there essentially as a platform for an AV experience where a visitor will see a presentation, a representation of a soldier's eye view of aviation from the trenches. So we see aircraft operating over the front with the dialogue between soldiers, kind of giving a play-by-play of what they're seeing. We also have what we call a trench table, which is an interactive space that highlights three different scenarios, 1914, 1916, 1918. That's intended to show the progression of how the airplane is used in the battlefield. So 1914, we're looking essentially at Mons. So we've got Charlton and Wadham's flight represented in their Blériot, finding the main line of German advance. We've got a scenario from Verdun in 1916, and we're taking Henri Farré's, some of his accounts that he had in Skyfighters of France, and looking at aerial reconnaissance and artillery adjustment from a Caudron in 1916. And then 1918, as Al was talking about yesterday with Irwin and Balcom, with First Aero, we're featuring that September 12th mission on the morning of September 12th at San Miel in 1918, and kind of showcasing what a contact patrol operation is like at that period. And so we're showing that kind of progression of technology with the aircraft, but also what are the capabilities being employed, how are the aircraft interacting with the forces on the ground. So really trying to bring that out. In fact, that's I've been working on that particular part of the project this weekend. So one of the big things that's coming up for us now is starting to work in these digital interactives and starting to spend a lot of time getting those sussed out. Our Unit 400 is a technology display, and that deals with a lot of the things that aren't pursuit aviation. So we've got a lot of focus on strategic bombing, naval aviation, propulsion technologies, and communication technologies. Carl, one of Carl's bailiwicks on various radios, and oxygen systems, aircraft instrumentation. Unit 500 is our manufacturing industry section, using Dayton Wright DH4 serial number 1 as basically the case study. We've also got the very first Liberty engine in the collection, and we highlight that as part of that manufacturing story. Our Camel is there essentially to be a case study for operations, as well as technology and people stories related to it. So the entire area around the Camel is intended to be a focused study on who used the Camel, how was it used, and a little bit about the technologies itself that are employed on it. And lastly, our Unit 700 is meant to be a entry into the post-war era. What is the legacy of World War I aviation? Everything from air power advocacy to the foundations of civil aviation. You can get some sense of the kind of the construction here relative to the Camel. These are some views of the gallery. Unfortunately, these are rather drab, and the reason they're drab is that none of the graphics are yet represented in it. So we don't have a visualization yet where the graphics have been incorporated. In fact, one of my most challenging jobs is to integrate the 3D physical design with the graphic development, because they're different contractors. Our project is so big, we can't have a single contractor do everything. So we've got one large design firm that's doing the graphics, one large design firm that's doing the 3D design, and unfortunately, I essentially have to be the referee that kind of integrates those two things and making sure that those elements come together in a way that is coherent. So making sure that the right label and the right visual, the right graphic goes in the right spot. It's a big challenge. But anyway, this is, accept it for what it is. It's a incomplete view of the space. It'll give you some sense, though, of kind of the volumetric aspects of how it's going together. Artifacts, of course, are the bread and butter of the National Air and Space Museum. We, of course, pride ourselves on the ability to conserve artifacts for an indefinite period, or at least as long as possible. So that's really where kind of the heart and soul of what we're trying to put on display is. And I can only give you just a small taster of what we're trying to do. These are some of the larger artifacts. We are getting a 1/48 scale SL-11 fabricated. We were trying to use the Imperial War Museum's one that they had done a few years ago, kind of as a model. And actually, we were just looking at that and finding out there might be a few issues with theirs that we're trying to improve on. So it's an interesting process. We learn a lot. There are 20 display cases in the gallery, a lot of which are fairly significant size. So it's a lot of artifact display for a fairly small area. We are displaying more artifacts than we did in the last gallery, even though it's a slightly smaller space. So some of our highlight artifacts do not fit in the gallery, but that is not necessarily a problem. So for instance, the Voisin that we said was so kind of obstructed in its view before, it's actually going outside the entrance. So it'll be outside the west entrance. If you're familiar with the space, it'll be it's over the mezzanine, kind of between the gallery and the IMAX theater. The great thing is you'll now have very long vistas all the way down the second floor mezzanine on both sides to see the aircraft. So there's a lot of opportunities for viewing the aircraft from a lot of different viewpoints. Lighting is going to be a lot better, so I think it's really going to be fantastic. And then on the other side, we'll have the D5A, so we'll also have some really great opportunities to get fantastic views on those aircraft. Mention some of the other aircraft that we've got, some previous fan favorites. There's Javier Arango's Camel. We've got Ray Brooks's SPAD 13. We try and tell a bit more of the Ray Brooks story, so there's a couple different ways that we're trying to do that. One is we're having actors read some of the letters between Brooks and his wife Ruth, or his fiancée Ruth at that time, talking about his famous dogfight on September 14th where he single-handedly survived an attack by 8 D-7s and brought down 2 of them, but barely survived. We've got some photos here. You can kind of get a sense of some of the work being undertaken at the moment on some of the big artifacts. This is how we lay out some of the cases. So this is our case with a lot of the communications equipment. This is one of our cases for the Camel. You can see the Bentley rotary there. This is a case on observation aircraft, a mix of models. We've got a parachute container for a observation balloon basket. We've got a camera. We've got a tunic from somebody from 135th Aero. There's our Chris Moore working on our, we've got a cutaway D7 model that we've got displayed near the aircraft, so you can actually get a sense of the interior. Some of the other models that you can see in the exhibit that are going through our conservation process. Of course, we've got a lot of armament, some of the radio equipment we've mentioned. One of my favorite artifacts is the Drexler steering gauge. So the basically first generation gyro attitude instrument that was used on the Stockens. Camera, propellers, got a carburetor, Billy Mitchell's pennant from the bombing trials after the war. A lot of textile work that's going on. This is recently we've just finished the uniform display. There's a few famous names in there. We've got Mitchell, Kiffin Rockwell, Eddie Rickenbacker, are a few of the folks represented in this display, but you get a sense of some of the uniforms as they're getting prepped. Of course, got a lot of fabric taken off of various aircraft. So one of our German balloon cross you can see being treated at Roundel. Got some art, period art that are going in there. Mentioned the script. Takes up an incredible amount of time. This gives you a sense of this. There's probably about 250 pages long for our script development, but give you a sense of what that looks like. Mechanical interactives are a big element for us, and one of the things that we want to do there is to give the visitor an opportunity to interact with more complex technologies or something that would be kind of alien to them. So Chris has done a lot of work on helping us set up a synchronization representation to show how that works. We've got a camel control stick near the camel. That's really the sounds of the camel. So, kids can come in and hear a blip switch or the firing levers. Now, one of our challenges is that the most destructive force in the universe is a middle school boy, and we get a lot of those. So, your kind of standard is silverback gorilla. So, for instance, on the camel control stick, we dispensed with the actual levers and went with buttons because those will survive those kinds of forces. So whatever we do, we have to make sure we'll not get ripped off. Anything that's not in a case, we make sure that we have a 4-foot touch distance so that there's no easy accessibility. For aerial reconnaissance, one of the things that we do is we have a photo interpretation table. So we have several backlit, large photographic images, actual images taken from National Archives. We have some insets then of things that visitors are supposed to find, and then they'll take a magnifier and sweep across and try to find those. We've got, another one on observation balloons, where we want to showcase sight lines, so between 0 and 500 meters, give a sense of what sight lines are at different altitudes. This one's been proving a little bit difficult for me, trying to find actual archival images for all the different altitudes. So if you've got any thoughts on that one, let me know. I do have some from 300 meters and 500 meters, but it'd be nice to have a little bit more of a mix. Mentioned the big screen that we've got up at the front that's going to be flying aircraft from flying collections, particularly Rhinebeck. We're going to start filming in May for that. Here's our trench environment where you look through the periscopes, our interactive table, our video screens that we have at both sides of the gallery. This gives you kind of a sense of that space. Graphics, of course, we want to use a lot of period art and bring in representations from the time. So this is just a small smattering. Henri Faure, that you see. So a lot of art that was done at the time. Tullio Crawley, done in the 30s. So this is for our final unit where we're talking about some of the legacy of aviation. We did want to stick kind of at the end a little bit of our legacy, some of that popular culture element that was in the previous gallery. So this past summer, I had an intern go to the Library of Congress and scan their entire collection of 30s era pulp covers related to World War I aviation. If anybody's interested in that, let me know. I'm happy to provide all those. So they're nice high-res scans. So we've got a nice display of those. This gives you a sense of kind of the feel of how a lot of the archival images have been treated. I can't tell you how much effort has gone to get interesting archival images. We're about 50% National Archives, about 30% our archives, about 10% Imperial War Museum, about 10% other sources. But we've been ingesting tens of thousands of images, trying to pick the best of those images for the exhibit. Gives you kind of a sense of the graphic flavor. You notice there are a couple of colorized images here. We don't really do a lot with that, but for some of the very big kind of graphic signposts, we were trying to do a little bit of subtle colorization. So if it's a meaningful archival image, we're definitely not colorizing it, but there's just a hint of that to give a little bit of a visual emphasis. And then lastly, kind of our standard graphic layout. I think one of the things that we're doing is nice is putting national roundels on all the artifacts or the cross for Central Powers. Anyway, this kind of gives you a good representation of the gallery, and happy to take any questions that you might have.
As with yesterday, if you have a question, come on down to the mic. I noticed in one of the gallery pictures that you had some stairways shown. Is there going to be any elevated look into the main gallery?
No, unfortunately not. Mezzanines are incredibly expensive. We do have one in our Apollo gallery, but yeah, they tend to add a fairly stratospheric cost. So yeah, unfortunately, you have to put it, for accessibility, you have to put an elevator in. So something we try and avoid if at all possible.
Roger, great talk, and not so much a question, just to tell you, I was pleased to see that you had a little sitting area. I don't know if there's something display there. In 1993, I took my wife to be there, and I proposed to her in the World War I gallery, and I was at a fix to where to find a place to sit. So the little theater that was there, she never said yes. But next year we'll be married 30 years, and we have 2 kids. So thanks for that.
Seating is something we have to fight for. It's very easy for that to get missed, but yes, that's always something that, and it can be very hard to put in. But yes, seating is always something we do try and fight for.
Question about the Albatross D5A. How are you going to tell the story and still keep it simple? Because that aircraft has a very storied history, particularly when it was hanging from the ceiling at the De Young Museum in San Francisco and so on and so forth.
I think I'll have to let Chris probably tell you more about it. He's our World War I curator.
Okay.
But in terms of our presentation, this is an unfortunate aspect of having it displayed outside the gallery. So basically, it'll get a label. So there's not a deep dive on the Albatross, unfortunately.
Okay.
But there is the web material. So Air and Space is developing an extensive digital environment, and information relates to that. So there's your resources, because there's only so much that can go on a signage.
Right.
And that, I think, it speaks to certainly a next phase of development is looking at how all this material that we've ingested, and I don't know how much you follow in terms of what the Smithsonian has been putting out over time, but there is a vast amount of documentation, much like the National Archives, in terms that has been filtering out. The real challenge, of course, is starting to put a frame around that where it's both accessible and coherent in some way. But that's very much, once we're done with the 3D design, that's really the next phase, is to try and make that
one
accessible.
example, particularly on the strop, if it's going to be hanging from the ceiling, it's going to be obvious that on the fuselage and probably the top of the upper wing, you've got Eisenerkreuz, but on the lower wing, you've got the Balkenkreuz, and people looking at that may say, well, why is that?
Right.
Hi there. I was at both the Mole and the Udvar-Hazy last week, and I was slightly disappointed that you hadn't found a temporary place to put the aircraft exhibits while all the reconstruction's going on.
Yes, basically a bandwidth problem. So, yeah, it's a real challenge to kind of juggle all the balls. So to be able to, assemble and disassemble for movement, it basically, there's just not enough time to do that. One of our big challenges, by the way, in terms of the way this has been funded, and I mentioned that the federal government's put in $250 million. What I didn't say is that private money is putting in $675 million. And so this is all funded by private money. So this is all donor money that's doing, everything I just showed you, that's all donor money that's come in. The federal money, we can use that money for things, for transportation, reinstallation of things that have come out of the museums that were on display. And one unfortunate aspect of that is that it's privileged those aircraft that were previously on display to go back in. So it really kind of tied our hands. So, kind of choosing the Halberstadt or the Caudron or the Jenny or one of those aircraft were much less of an option for us because of the way it was funded. So that's been a complication. And one of the things, of course, we have to do now is once we finish the exhibit is to go back and look at something like, say, the Snipe or the Faults or, where are we going to work that in terms of Udvar-Hazy about getting that back on display. That's going to take through much of the rest of the decade. So just because of the bandwidth involved and the resources, and we're working 150% right now on this. So unfortunately, Udvar-Hazy has suffered as a result, being able to accommodate a lot of additions in there. So it really is just a bandwidth question in terms of how long it takes to do that. But we're very aware of that desire to make sure the things that came out from the previous display that aren't going back in can be displayed at Udvar-Hazy, and then trying to make sure that everything gets its due.
Thank you.
I guess the first question would be, I would love to go ahead and get a cover slide of the Pulp Fiction covers. But I'll talk to you about that. I couldn't agree with you more about the attention span that people have nowadays. Unfortunately, it's due to these things. So in our museum, I was noticing that we get, if you had somebody under the age of 20, 21, that would actually spend 20 seconds looking at something, it was a miracle. And I wanted to share with you that as soon as I went ahead and I put in a doghouse about yay high with Snoopy on it in the World War I area, everything just came to a screeching halt. The little kids would just stay glued, and the whole family would have to stay there, okay? And then I thought, well, let's go one step further. I had an observation balloon basket that we had made, nothing quite as ornate as that. And I stuck a dog in there to represent Rags the dog from the 1st Division. That was another one. So, boy, I put one was on one end, one was on the other, and you know what? The World War I display became the most looked at place ever, But it is tough going and keeping people's attention for a length of time. Of course, you pretty much do it the best from what I've seen.
And so we've got Snoopy making an appearance again. So he will be in the camel area. So also in the camel area, we've got a life-size recreation of Fokker, who was the mascot for the 148th, which is U.S. Camel Squadron. And so yeah, the kids can pet Fokker, the mascot, and then we have a basically an interactive book that is a sample of various squadron mascots. So talk about the mascots, something for the kids.
Can't wait to see it.
You can pose with Fokker, the French bulldog, or you can pet him, or
Yeah. Can't wait to see that. I should mention also, I give battlefield tours in the Samuel area, and we also found out that Rin Tin Tin, along with Rags and Sergeant Stubby, they were all within about a 5-kilometer area of each other. And as Mr. Schultz happened to put on there, when you see Snoopy, okay, you'll see a little sign in the background with Pont de Mousson pointing.
Right.
It just all kind of tied it all together. But, thank you. Kids are the future. They really are.
Yeah, so during your talk you mentioned that the sort of the artifacts that you have a strong bias towards the late war, right? And seeing this image here kind of made me wonder what is the museum's kind of balance philosophy around, United States history versus other nations, especially in a topic like this, and then also with the artifact situation that are pushing more towards the end of the war.
Yeah, so about 25% of our visitors are international, so it's 3/4 domestic audience. And we are a U.S. national museum, so that does tend to, skew the interest. So if we're talking about it, a deep dive on an ace in their aircraft, Ray Brooks is kind of a great case study because we've got an ace's plane, we've got, his letters, so it is very much an American perspective on some of those aspects, so that the entry point is there. What we try to do is things like our immersive experience where we'll have access to Old Rhinebeck's Taube, for instance, try to bring in more of the other theaters that maybe aren't as well covered, so a little bit more Eastern Front, and some of the other voices that maybe are not as otherwise broadly expressed. And so we're very aware that yes, there are some gaps that come in because of these various points of emphasis. So it is something we have to be very careful about, that we don't get overly focused on that American experience. And so things like the video that we have in our manufacturing section, which is very much otherwise focused on the DH-4 and Liberty. In the manufacturing side, the video part of it is very much oriented towards international manufacturing.
I think we have time for one more if it's short.
So, Kip Lankanaugh. So I work with their docents a lot. I really appreciate talking with them, but I think we all here really appreciate your efforts keeping the World War I information alive. Obviously, we have a lot more interest than the typical person who's doing the run the dash, the flash, and all that kind of stuff. It's really interesting from our perspective. You want to see who your primary customers are. Is you go to the gift shop at any Smithsonian museum, and you can see the Natural History Museum. They're selling dinosaur kits. Most of your things are selling coffee mugs, hats, T-shirts, hoodies. So, and if you go into Hazy, the first thing that everyone gets excited about is nothing that's a biplane. They're looking at the SR-71. So we realize we're so far removed from that. But you're aware of that, and you're aware of the significance, and thank you for making the effort to try to balance the approach somewhat wherever you can. Thank you very much.
Thank you.